I've got one question for you. Vikings? Valheim is a survival sandbox game where you are a dead person thrown into the very Viking-inspired landscape with loosely Norse mythological themes. I say loosely inspired because I know very little on Norse mythology, and I saw Odin mentioned, and I can't be bothered to check its accuracy, so I'm just going to presume that this is at least 10% accurate. This game is a very interesting specimen, where while I thoroughly enjoy my time with this game, it's also got a number of issues that end up making me feel mixed at the end of all of it. Why is this the case? Well, let's dive in and find out. Also, if you like what you see today, consider hitting the like and subscribe button, or don't. You do you, I'm not your mom. Let's begin. First off, let's discuss the main objective of the game. In Valheim, your objective is to gear up and fight 7 big boss guys and earn a place in Valhalla. You gear up through your typical survival sandbox gameplay loop of resource gathering and crafting, though don't let the simplistic visuals and gameplay loop fool you. This game has tons of mechanics for the player to learn and adapt to. For one, almost everything you do has a skill level. Running, jumping, chopping trees, punching things in the face, and all the weapon choices have skills that level up from you just doing those things. Leveling up these skills actively buff your stats for that exact trait, mostly in the form of like damage and knockback increases, reduced stamina usage, stuff like that. It kind of reminds me of like RuneScape or Oblivion in that regard. However, if you die, you will lose 5% of your total levels in each skill on the default settings, so death could lead to a hefty setback even after you get your stuff back. The next major mechanic in this game is its nutrition system. Your character can consume up to 3 meals, each meal you consume giving you a temporary stat buff, usually in the form of health or stamina. It's honestly not all that complicated, and it's mostly fine, but there is one thing I have against it, and we'll get to that in the con section review, but just know that it's fine. It exists. Base building in this game is pretty fascinating as well, with a plethora of different mechanics in of itself. It has a pseudo-grid-based system, kind of like Palworld, but this game came out first. You are limited to a radius within your workbench to start building. You place down a floor somewhere, and from there, everything else sort of snaps into place. You can even adjust how it snaps to the base. There's also a structural stability mechanic, so building giant mega bases with no structural support will just result in your base falling apart, which I think is pretty funny. All these mechanics are pretty simple, but these handful of mechanics are going to follow you for the rest of the game pretty much from start to finish. Especially when you build different bases so you can fast travel around the world with a teleporter. Now earlier I did mention that you had to gear up to fight the bosses, so I suppose I should get around to talking about that. Gear in this way is handled in a pretty interesting way. At the beginning of the game, it seems pretty straightforward, until you realize that there's an upgrade tab and there is such a thing as set bonuses. The upgrade tab is pretty neat, and honestly one of my favorite features I've seen in a game like this. Upgrading your armor and tools at a crafting station of any kind allows it to gain a pretty simple stat buff, and you can upgrade it up to a limit based on your crafting station's level. By the way, I forgot to mention it, but you level up your crafting station by putting other buildings around it. Anyways, these upgrades actually allow you to use your older items for longer, as they can be upgraded to be equivalent to the gear in the next stages of the game. That being said, the higher tier items will always perform better and scale better, but it's at least an option if a resource has become scarce or if you're more focused on putting your resources elsewhere as the game gets harder. I'm also just kind of a sucker for upgrading your tools with materials, so I guess I just love it for that reason as well. Armor in this game is interesting in the prospect that there are just certain armor sets with set bonuses. Like, your starting leather armor is really only going to serve as protection and pretty much nothing else, but once you get troll hide, you can actually get a set of armor that increases your stealth stat. And there's plenty of other armor sets that have set bonuses as well. These two systems are actually incredibly helpful when you start stomping on bosses' toes. Speaking of which, beating bosses in this game is the primary objective. At the time of this video, there are currently 7 bosses to defeat, and all of them are pretty cool. They can range from Groot with an anger problem to an elk with the unmatched power of Thor's ass blasts. The fights in this game are super intense and visually memorable in my opinion, to a point where I went ahead and fought them more than once. Not really for any particular reason, just because it was fun. And once you beat one boss, it's time to plan for the next. This creates an honestly really satisfying game loop where you gear up, fight a boss, gear up to a higher tier, fight the next. It's very much like Terraria or insert MMORPG here. Plus, once you beat the boss, you often get a cool new buff you can trigger at the sacrificial hooks, like reduced stamina usage or more tree damage. So the game even incentivizes you to do so. Honestly, I could keep gushing about a lot of the mechanics here, but for the sake of the video's runtime, I'm just gonna lightning round a bunch of them and then get to the cons. Sailing has actual wind catching mechanics. Trees, once chopped, fall down and do big damage to either you or nearby trees, sometimes causing a tree domino effect. You can run up steep slopes, but if your stamina runs out, you slide back down. There's dungeons all over the map that you can crawl into for useful items. You can do stealth, beekeeping, piss off a troll. There's so much in this game that it's honestly staggering sometimes. Now, you might be hearing me gush about this game, and to yourself you're saying, you said you had mixed feelings, but you clearly love the game. Which to that I say, I definitely love this game, but the problem is that the game also has some questionable design choices, as well as one major setback that prevents me from confidently suggesting this game as a no-brainer pickup. So, let's talk about it. The game has a handful of weird design choices that either feel clunky or pretty awful to play around. For example, you know how I mentioned nutrition had a problem? Well, that problem is that as the timer for your meal ticks down, so does your buff. For some star-spangled reason, the devs decided that your food buff wouldn't be at max value for its entire duration. This isn't inherently game-ruining, but like, what? Wouldn't it make more sense to let the buff last the time limit and then deteriorate at a semi-fast pace once the timer runs out? I get it's better than instantly losing all those stats the second the buff ends, but it feels weird to design it to where it feels like I have 15 minutes of extra 30 health, only for it to not be the full 30 health for its duration. Like, why? I mean, I got used to it, but still, weird. Also, when it comes to enemy pathfinding, it's whack as hell. Sometimes the enemies find their way to you no issue, but other times it's like the enemies just lack object permanence. This pathfinding also creates issues with the boss fights, where you can pretty easily dance around rocks or pillars near the altars to avoid most of their attacks. The bosses do have attacks that can get around this, so you can still get in some reasonable danger for doing it, but it's generally better to only have to put up with one attack than the whole arsenal. I don't know if the devs could ever fix this honestly, considering it's a sandbox game and if players want to break pathfinding, they will, but it's one thing I had to bring up. Now, these complaints aren't actually the reason why I have mixed feelings. In fact, if these were the only issues, then my opinion would just remain great on it and we'd move on. There's actually something else that I have to talk about, and it requires a disclaimer. The reason for the disclaimer is because this particular complaint is pretty divisive and has people mixed in general on how to perceive this, so here comes the disclaimer. I'm just going to cut to it. I am under the belief that a dev team should take their time to polish updates and game features before releasing them, and I personally have no issues waiting on updates. I would much rather wait for an update to be as polished as possible than have it be rushed out for the sake of meeting a deadline and it being the most broken shit I've ever seen. The reason I'm making this next criticism isn't with the intention to rush the devs, but with the intention to inform someone who might be considering purchasing the game of the state of development. That critique being the game's development cycle. This game has been out for 4 years. Out in early access for 4 years. With 4 years, you'd think the game would have a ton of new updates at this point that have added major features, and therein lies the situation, folks. This game has had, in grand total, 5 major updates in the past 4 years. And that's not to say it never gets updated, like it definitely does get updates in between for like bug fixes or fine tuning, and even sometimes adding in little tiny details that don't really add much to the game but just kind of let you know, hey, we're still working on it. But still, 5 major updates in 4 years. 2 of which dropped in 2024. Now, I'm all for the game taking its time to be good. Like I said, I don't have an issue waiting for content, but I know there's a lot of people out there who would take an issue with it. Which is why my opinion is mixed. It's not that the game is bad, far from it actually. It's one of my favorite sandbox experiences I've ever had. But since it's in early access, I have to give this warning. If you're going to consider buying the game, don't enter with the mentality of, oh, it'll get more features to be worth its value later. Instead, ask yourself if the game is worth its value as it stands right now. Which, in all honesty, I think that should just be a mentality you take with early access titles anyways. All things considered, if you're buying a game, whether there's the prospect that it will get better later, it's kind of a goofy thing to do. But, you know, still, for this particular game of all games, you should definitely think of that. Have the updates been good? Absolutely. I don't think there's been a single update that Valheim has ever released that's been problematic, but I wanted to put this out there that if you are going to get this game, what you're buying right now is probably going to be how it's going to be for like the next 6 months to a year. All that being said, I will say this. The game is solid as hell. The gameplay is fun, the visuals are sort of unique and charming, the game shockingly has wonderful lighting, and the devs have shown time and time again with each update that they have nothing but passion for this project, and honestly, it gives me high hopes for the future. If you like the idea of a survival sandbox with some Terraria RuneScape-inspired mechanics, I'd recommend it so long as you don't mind a rather slow development cycle. And if you ever get the game, I hope you enjoy. This has been The Bottom Dweller. Gonna give Odin a big ol' smooch.